In the modern era where the comic book superhero on film is as ubiquitous and mainstream as it gets, not unlike the Western genre or musicals of years past, it's easy to forget where this trend became big and ran with the momentum that we currently experience them with. People can credit Richard Donner's Superman in 1978 as the first modern superhero blockbuster.
Yeah.
You had Tim Burton's Batman in 1989, but in the late 90s, that genre as we know it, which was already sort of niche aside from a handful of really popular blockbusters, in the late 90s, it was a dead film category.
Thank you, Joel Schumacher.
Often Batman and Robin, the fourth in that original Batman cycle from Warner Brothers, was considered the nail in the coffin, so to speak. Who can forget Shaq with Shaquille O'Neal in 1997?
Was it called? What was it called?
Steel, Shaq.
Yeah,
my bad. All right, let me repeat.
He's
Steel.
also Kazam, right?
Yeah.
But he wasn't a superhero. He's a genie.
That was a genie, yeah. So in the late 90s, because of box office flops like Steel, Shaq Fu, and Batman and Robin, Hollywood studios weren't looking to pump big money into flops like that. Hollywood is obviously a very fickle industry, because if you do have a hit, if you have a movie like The Matrix, which is a huge success, they call it a watershed film. You're going to get a dozen poor Matrix knockoffs.
Yes.
Because of the success of Batman in 1989, not necessarily comic book movies, but you had films like The Rocketeer, The Phantom, The Shadow with Alec Baldwin. These were all based off of
Dick Tracy.
Dick Tracy, yes. Yeah, these 1930s and 40s pulp heroes. It wasn't until July 2000 where we had that next watershed film.
Correct.
The studios were looking for, okay, what's going to be the next hot IP? How can we cash in on the success of this particular film? And that film was director Bryan Singer's X-Men. Hi, I'm Ryan Bijan, and this is The Unusual Suspect.
Yeah,
The
Unusual Suspect.
The life and films of director Bryan Singer. And I am here with
Connor Quade. Good to be back. We're joined by
Spencer Wallace. Glad to be here.
All right, guys, it's great to have you here in the studio today. So yeah, X-Men, and this was a movie that we were just the right age. I know I was 9 years old when I saw it in July of 2000. What are your earliest memories of this particular film?
For me, I didn't see it in theaters. I was too young. I think I was 8 when it came out. So I got it on VHS like that next year because it used to take a while for it to come out on VHS. And I would watch that VHS all the time. And then I got the DVD like a couple years later. So I would say around 9 or 10 is when I first got aware of X-Men. I don't really remember watching it for the first time because I was so young. It's just kind of always been in my head.
Yeah, for myself, I was 10. I remember seeing it in theaters with a buddy of mine. My dad took us to see it. But really, I don't think, as far as vivid memories of it in theaters, I don't have too much of that. The one I have more memories of is an X-Men, but I won't get into that. But that would be the later film that would kind of catapult the Marvel Universe Spider-Man. But I do remember seeing X-Men in theaters, but I think it had more traction with me with home video.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like that was a film I remember day one when it was on VHS. I went to the local video store and I had to have it. You know what? I don't even think it was a video store. I think it was like at Albertsons. My mom was,
Yes.
which is like a local grocery chain. My mom was shopping and they had it out there on the rack, and I had to have a copy.
It used to be like that, for sure.
Back in the day. But now let's talk about X-Men a little bit as an intellectual property. The X-Men, Marvel's merry gang of mutants, made their first appearance in September 1963. They were created by writer Stan Lee, rest in peace.
R.I.P.
And Jack Kirby, also, again, legend. So, X-Men at the time, I know Stan Lee's talked about this at great length. They've asked him, like, what was the origin of these characters? How did you come up with this team of socially outcast, angsty teenagers learning to control their powers in a world that fears and hates them? And are you guys familiar with the story, what his response was? Stanley basically said at that point they had created so many different types of superheroes with different power configurations and origins. He just wanted to come up with something where, hey, we're too lazy to come up with an origin. Why not just have them be born with their powers?
Wow.
That's cool.
Yeah, because by the time the X-Men came out in 63, you already had the Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, I believe Iron Man, the Incredible Hulk, the Avengers. So a lot of the Marvel mainstays had already been created at that point. But yeah, X-Men, it just came out of, hey, we need to get this title, we need to have a new title on the market, we need to make some more money, what can we come up with on this week's notice? And at the same time, like, you have to remember back then, like, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the illustrator, they were working on, like, what, 6-7 different titles a month at the same time.
Yeah, they were working on so much stuff. Like, they were not living the high life. They were working very hard doing all this stuff. And,
they were not making Disney money back then. So yeah, but unfortunately, X-Men at that time, with the original core team, which it consisted of Cyclops, Scott Summers, Marvel Girl, Jean Grey, Warren Worthington III, the Angel, eventually the Archangel, Hank McCoy, Beast, and Bobby Drake, the Iceman.
The Iceman.
That original team, I guess it had modest sales, but by the end of the 60s, it was kind of dead in the water. It really didn't gain any traction. It wasn't until the revival in the early 70s where they introduced characters like Storm, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Colossus, that the X-Men really became...
So many great characters.
Iconic characters. That's when the team really, the Uncanny X-Men, became an important part of our popular culture. And there was no greater time than the early 90s where the X-Men were the face of Marvel Comics. X-Men comic book sales, cartoons, toys, the love for this brand was at a fever pitch. So even at a time where, you know, Warner Brothers had some success with the Batman sequels, there had been some Superman movies in the 80s, you know, studios were afraid to take a risk and bet on what they consider to be secondary characters. But even in the aftermath of Richard Donner's Superman and its sequels, the X-Men property had been in development hell for many years, bouncing around from studio to studio. So Connor, do you want to talk about that, some of those earlier iterations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was bouncing around from studio to studio, like Bryan said, for, I would say, since Batman 89. So as soon as that was a big hit, people were, like, looking for the next hot property to make buku's amounts of money with. And Singer is attached to X-Men in 96, and the movie comes out in 2000. So before he's attached to it, it went through so many different scriptwriters, including Ed Solomon, who wrote Men in Black, Andrew Kevin Walker, who wrote 7 and 8mm, John Logan, who wrote Gladiator and is like a big name now in his own right, making shows and movies. I think James Schamus, it says James Schamus came in to do a rewrite to make the characters deeper. He's Ang Lee's co-writer. He wrote Crouching Tiger and Hulk and all that to flesh out the characters, which apparently was not really done at that point. Joss Whedon came on to do it before Bryan was attached. Like, and the scripts kept getting rejected, you know, and that's why it wasn't moving forward, essentially. And it wasn't until Bryan signed on to it, he and his producer, Tom DeSanto, created the story, and that's what really got it back to being greenlit again.
So that's what got the ball rolling. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was one of the earlier 90s, maybe late 80s iterations, James Cameron, I believe, was attached to develop the X-Men property. But then I believe at that point he had abandoned it because he was signed on to do Spider-Man.
Spider-Man, yeah, that's correct.
And I think at that point was X-Men also, it was a canon film property.
Yes.
So it was like X-Men, Spider-Man, they had been bouncing around. And it's just amazing where... Now, we live in a time where there's such a quick turnaround for, like, reboots and reimaginings. I know in our own lifetimes, like, how many separate iterations of Spider-Man have we seen on the big screen?
It's at least 3 at this point, right?
Yeah, but
But
it's ridiculous. I mean, back then, because it was a riskier prospect, the studio would literally spend years and decades developing a project, sometimes for it to go nowhere, or... if it's a project like X-Men or Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in 2002, eventually it would get off the ground. But that's amazing, Connor, the point that you make, that Bryan Singer was attached as early as 1996, and it took 4 years of development.
Yep.
There have been films that have been developed with a director attached for much longer that never see the light of day.
Yeah.
They spend years of their life invested in this property, and then the studio pulls the plug. How did X-Men get made?
the story behind why X-Men got made is that Bryan Singer and Tom DeSanto's storyline, who Tom DeSantos, he was an assistant director on At Pupil, who we talked about in the allegations last time, that may or may not have been involved with that. And they rewrote the script, which was originally done by Christopher McQuarrie, who wrote The Usual Suspects. So it was already kind of in Bryan's universe, but McQuarrie was approached by himself. And then that was rejected. They rescinded the green light. Then Singer and DeSantos came up with pretty much how to fix the problems that the producer Laura Schuller-Donner and Ralph Winter thought of what was wrong with it, including like too many origins, it's too long, there's too many characters. So they kind of pared it down to a more manageable screenplay that you could read and understand without knowing the comics. Because this was 2000, so a lot of people working in the entertainment industry were not watching X-Men, the show. They didn't know anything about X-Men. So you read the script, there's 10, 12 characters, and it's really hard for a studio exec to imagine it if they don't know all those characters already. So they just kind of pared it down and made it simpler, I guess.
And right, from a screenwriting perspective, that's a really kind of tall order and tough challenge. Like you said, to juggle a dozen main characters with different powers and skill sets. How do you get the audience to care about these characters in under 2 hours? Where now, it's amazing, like things have changed so much. Studios like Marvel Studios, they have the luxury where it's just like, oh, let's introduce Iron Man, then Thor, then Captain America. Then if it's successful, we can put them all together, but they did not have that luxury in the late 90s, early 2000s. They had to get it right in one shot.
Yep, this was it. This was the shot for X-Men. You got to get it all in there, for sure. I would say that in 96, when Bryan signed on, then he signed on to At Pupil and made At Pupil. Then he came back after they would rework the script more, and then production really started going after he came back from At Pupil, I would say. That's when the behind-the-scenes stuff really started happening, that we know about, that's been documented at least.
So once Bryan Singer came, he was already attached, but you said Chris McQuarrie was already in development writing the script even before 96.
Yes, he was.
Singer was attached. So when Singer came on board, you watch interviews with this man. He's a very passionate filmmaker. He loves movies. He loves science fiction. But he's, self-admittedly not a huge comic book reader. As a child, but I understand he did watch a lot of the X-Men animated series and read a lot of the bigger comic books at that time to prep for the film.
Yeah, in his commentary, he says that he watched the show in his prep work, like all 84 episodes or however many episodes there are, and that he said it was like great and he loved it. So you could tell, he was studying it. He wasn't an avid comic book fan like a Kevin Smith, but he was watching the show and reading. For sure. And he hired the writer, David Hayter, for the movie, was hired because he knew the comics, and Bryan needed somebody to write the script who knew the comics. That's how David Hayter got his job. He was a phone guy.
Yeah, and based on what we've read and seen and kind of our research, Bryan Singer, he's definitely a hands-on director. He does a lot of writing on the set and just trying to fine-tune the movie and make it as good as possible. Now, we both read an earlier draft of the final X-Men film that I think this is basically the final script they wrote before shooting, and then David Hayter came on board to make the tweaks.
That's what it looks like. It's either that or the script that was given before DeSanto and Singer came on. It's one of those two. I'm not sure.
Really, well, what's amazing, even though that one is a little bit more of an ensemble piece and there are some major divergences, there's a lot of scenes were very much verbatim included in the final film. And the basic plot structure is pretty much the same movie, but there are a lot of interesting changes that Bryan made when he came on board to kind of condense and simplify the plot. Can we talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I would say the biggest thing he did was he streamlined the film into focusing on Wolverine and Rogue, essentially. These are the two vessels that he kind of melded certain different origin scenes in the script to fit those two characters and really used them as an entryway for the audience to get to know the X-Men, because back then, of course, 2000, you can't take for granted that everyone knows who the X-Men are, what their powers are. So he basically uses those two characters as an entryway into discovering the powers of others, instead of just giving an origin scene of people as kids. So many, it would just cost too much money. So they essentially use those two characters to show the powers and the personalities of the actual X-Men. So I think that's one of the biggest things he changed, is that he really streamlined that aspect of it. And he also, Pyro was originally in it. They got rid of him. He was supposed to be a Magneto henchman as well. They got rid of Beast as well. So they just got rid of characters. And
well, Beast was interesting because a lot of the lines and the purpose he serves in the script, that was given to Jean Grey. They were kind of combined into one character in the finished film.
Yeah, they made her a kind of doctor, scholarly, medical type, like doctor. A lot of very Beast-like, especially when you see that X-Men, the animated series,
Mm-hmm. So, like, Spencer, going back when you saw the first time in theaters, even though at that point, like I'm sure all of us here, we did watch the X-Men animated series. We were somewhat familiar with the comic books, and at that point, through osmosis, our generation grew up with those characters. What was your impression of seeing the film, and do you think they did justice to that cast?
I mean, that's...
Well, I mean, in terms of, like, the roster of characters.
Oh, the roster of characters.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. As far as character-wise, I think the only thing as a kid that I thought was missing was Gambit.
Yeah.
I always really loved the character of Gambit. I never really thought about it as a kid, though, more as an adult. But when you're going back through and you're talking about the characters that were cut, and you have to think this was 2000s before anything was ever established for X-Men, for a generalization or a general audience. No, I think it's great even now. But especially as a kid, being able to see like comic book come to life and not just have it be Batman related or Superman.
Yes.
Most definitely. No, I think the tone, everything was just set perfectly.
Well, it's funny. Okay, you did remind me of something else. The fact that before the success of X-Men, Marvel Studios did have a film released in 1998, which kind of bucked the trend a little bit, but it wasn't sold as a comic book superhero movie. So 98, you had Stephen Norrington's Blade, which
true.
I think is an amazing film.
Great
it's still,
movie.
I mean, the CGI is a little wonky, but the rest of the film still holds up. I think there's a lot of great, interesting parallels.
Way better than Blade 2, in my opinion.
I think they're both pretty good. Depends on if you're a Guillermo del Toro fan.
Yeah, true.
I do love Del Toro.
Yeah.
We can all agree they're better than Blade Trinity.
Yeah.
Let's be on the same page there.
That is true.
Yeah, but Blade was a film that came out in 98. It took the material very seriously. You had this Marvel comic book superhero reinvented as this martial arts wielding badass dressed in black leather. It was very grounded. And it's about a villain who is part of an ostracized community who wants to use his powers and resources to transform mainstream humanity into the monster he is, which in Blade's case, they're vampires. So Blade really did kick, in a way, I want to say it was like the prototype. I don't feel like it kicked everything in high gear the way X-Men and later Spider-Man would, but it's definitely worth mentioning that it was a financial success, and it was critically acclaimed for the time.
And the aesthetic is somewhat similar to X-Men and to The Matrix as well, which was the year after Blade. So maybe Blade's more important than we give it credit for. I don't know.
Right, well, that's what I want to talk about. And it's like not only the aesthetic, but even the structure of the film. You have Stephen Dorff's villain, Deacon Frost. His plan and his grand scheme, it's not that different from what Magneto's trying to do in the X-Men film, which is...
Well, he wants to make everybody mutants.
Yeah, by using the Statue of Liberty and using the device. And that's just kind of interesting. Like, Bryan Singer, I don't think he's been on record as far as my research. He's never talked about watching Blade and being like, oh, we should make it more like that.
Nope. I don't think he's ever mentioned Blade from anything I've read about him, ever.
I don't think he's mentioned Captain America 1990 either.
Oh, yeah, which that was canon films, right?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Hey, props to them for going for it. Just wasn't there yet.
Yeah, but going back to Blade real quick, I remember as a kid, they sold it it wasn't sold as a Marvel comic book superhero film. It was sold as like an R-rated action horror film, not unlike From Dusk Till Dawn, John Carpenter's Vampires. I mean, this was a very popular subgenre in the 90s.
Right,
Spawn in a way. Spawn was a little bit more super heroic.
Yeah.
He had the cape and the costume and the action figures.
But he was still the bad good guy.
The anti-hero.
Right,
well, even in 90s comics, the theme of the anti-hero is very popular.
Yeah.
So not only did you have characters like Wolverine and Blade, you had the Punisher, Ghost Rider. Everything was super hardcore.
Yeah. Was it Legends of the Dark Knight? Is that what... Do you remember that comic series, Legends of the Dark Knight? That was kind of like that.
That was a
I
great
remember.
one, yeah.
I remember that being a little more like anti-hero, violent type.
Well, Legends of the Dark Knight, I believe that was first published in 1989 to kind of ride the coattails of the Tim Burton Batman film. But yeah, that was very big in the 90s. A lot of great storylines there. So yeah, the 90s, it was the decade of the angsty anti-hero.
Yes.
And with the X-Men brand, that's kind of where you had that converge with the more mainstream, colorful superheroics and science fiction action. And then you cut to, in the late 90s, Bryan Singer trying to par that all down into a 2-hour movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. Do you guys want to go into the, because there's some great production stories, or do you guys want to go into the film itself?
I think, we're still talking about the behind-the-scenes process. So yeah, what kind of obstacles did Bryan have to deal with on making that first film?
Yeah, so like we said about the script, it was pretty much never done. It got greenlit from a storyline treatment, like I said, by Singer and DeSanto, and there's so many stories. Apparently, Michael Jackson came in to audition for Professor Xavier.
Have you heard that story? Here, tell me.
Oh my god, dude! Oh, you got to hear this. He was wearing sunglasses and refused to shake hands with Bryan Singer, which I think is very Michael Jackson. I guess he was still scared of AIDS and knew Bryan was gay. I don't know. And he said he was visiting. He wanted to talk to them about playing Professor Xavier, and they said, he's an old white guy. And Michael was like, yeah, I can wear makeup. It's fine. And that's not the end.
But he was white at that point.
He was white.
Fair.
That's why I was why would she tell him that? I don't know. And then what's so awesome is that he then showed a short film he made called Ghosts, in which he stars as a 60-something white mayor railing against a well-meaning performer who entertains local children with magic tricks. Okay, that just explains Michael's psychology in a nutshell, in my opinion. They said they never seriously considered him, but it was still a crazy event that he was there. Because it's Michael Jackson with all the allegations going on, and he was in the studio talking to Bryan. And apparently, according to Ralph Winter, the producer, he said that was just another day in the Bryan Singer entourage. He said Shaq came in to audition. Janet Jackson, Mariah Carey came in for Storm. I mean, this was just how Bryan... This was what he did. He said, it's another day in the Singer vortex in which nothing was predictable, impulsivity reigned, and there was always an entourage.
So you see Shaq show up, I want to be Colossus.
What is he? Why do you not put him in there? I don't know.
But real quick, okay, so you mentioned, this could be apocryphal, but I have read that at one point, Michael Jackson, this might have been the late 80s, he was considering buying Marvel Comics just so he could play Spider-Man in the film.
I've heard that too. I've heard that.
Really? That is awesome. I wish we could have gotten that. I would just he's swinging through the with Michael Jackson music over it. Hell yeah!
Come on.
And there's a lot of sources like Ralph Winter who said he always had a lot of friends around that he would bring. He's always very generous and would introduce his friends to everybody on the set, but it'd always be a new young male friend every day. So he's no one had time to keep track of all of his quote friends. Apparently, on the set of X-Men, he earned a well-reported reputation for, quote, costly absences as he partied with an ever-changing inner circle.
So even in the first X-Men movie.
Apparently, this is what this says. And this is the famous quote from Donner, the producer, where she says...
let's just clarify this. Okay. It's Laura Schuler Donner.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Who is the wife of director Richard Donner, who created the modern superhero genre with Superman.
Was Richard Donner an executive, though, on this, too?
He is credited.
I think he is.
Yeah, Richard Donner and his wife are both credited.
Okay, both, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
So that's kind of interesting tidbit there. Yeah, Donner single-handedly creating the superhero film. And she said, this is the quote, it says, Singer's behavior was poor on the movie, we accommodated him, and therefore we can accommodate him on the second one, and on, it created a monster. That's one of the big quotes from this Hollywood Reporter article.
But that's what year was that she came out and said that? Because that was a more
couple years ago.
Yeah.
But I think what's most interesting about X1 is the writing of it. We went through all the different writers, and Joss Whedon came in, and this was Laura Schuler Donner saying, Joss Whedon's script, she said, quote, it was so good. It had humor in it. Bryan wanted the movie to be much more serious and more dramatic. So apparently, like you were saying, just back then, that's what Bryan wanted. That was the style. He did not want it to be a funny film. So I think that's a really interesting kind of tidbit, is that he read Joss Whedon's script and was like, fuck this. No, this is not going to be funny. I think that's really interesting that, his vision was always to make it realistic and dramatic and interesting, and not a funny romp.
Which, of course, Marvel would have great success using that formula with Joss Whedon at the helm in 2012's Avengers, which I think the first Avengers movie is still a great film.
Great film.
Yeah,
great
absolutely.
film. Still great. It's not X-Men, but it's great.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, X-Men's excellent. The Avengers is excellent. Yeah. They're almost different genres, but they both great. They're both great because they honor their particular source materials in the way that's appropriate for each one.
Yeah, Avengers is good. It's a good movie. I don't have any problem with Avengers. I don't really like the MCU, but that's a damn good movie. But I think the most interesting point is that David Hayter, the writer, is the only credited writer on it because McQuarrie and Solomon asked to have their names removed because their script was, quote, changed too much.
But didn't they have story credit, or am I mistaken?
I don't think they did.
So it's just story, screenplay by...
Story is like...
David Hayter?
Hayter, Singer, DeSanto, I think, are the story. And then screenplay by Hayter. But it's kind of interesting that he was a friend of Bryan Singer's. He was Singer's assistant, answering phones in the production offices for $500 a week. But he had read the X-Men comics growing up, watched the show, was a huge fan, and Singer would rely on his comic book knowledge to basically rewrite scenes that in the writer's room, where all these writers were, they could not hack. And so what it came down to was that he ended up writing about 55% of the script, and the executives gave him a $30,000 check and said, that's all you're going to get. We're just giving this to you so you can't sue us, because they found out he was writing the script and they were really pissed off. And so this was kind of what we're going to get about the production of X-Men is really this whirlwind of it's in constant creation. The creation of the film is never stopping. This is just in the script phase. When he goes to the set with Singer, they're rewriting it there, too.
Which, to be fair, it's kind of... Again, I know there's a lot of politics involved, and everyone wants to get their payday and get their credit. Mm-hmm. But, in David Hayter's defense, the finished film, like we said earlier, it's not that drastically different in terms of structure from that earlier draft that had Beast and Pyro and all the extra characters. It's very much the same plot, the premise. There's whole pages of dialogue that are taken verbatim from the script. So it's not like he completely restructured it into something that was unrecognizable.
Mm-hmm.
So
well, yeah, that's why he wasn't supposed to be the only one credited with the screenplay.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be him and the two other people. So I
But why do you think they would take it so personally? Like, all they did was just make it flow better on camera.
Well, this is what I think, is that Ed Solomon wrote Men in Black, which was a huge hit, and McQuarrie had won an Oscar for Usual Suspects. These are two writers at the height of their egomania in the 90s. Yeah. So I think that they're just like, no, I'm a real writer. This guy answering phones, I don't want to be credited with him. So I think that probably has a lot. It's all just ego, I think. And they said they both regret it and they missed the money.
But they didn't get paid either way because they did the work.
They got paid for the work, but they missed the
residuals,
whatever that was.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's just so many amazing stories. He said that Terrence Stamp came in for Xavier as well.
I read he was considered for Magneto. Which he would have been very
Vigo came in for Wolverine. Viggo Mortensen. David Hayter said that he wanted Vigo to be Wolverine, but for some reason it just wouldn't happen. And then the whole Doug Reese Scott fiasco, where he was supposed to be Wolverine, but he broke his ankle on reshoots of MI2, which had gone over by 6 weeks, and they kept lying to Bryan Singer about his availability so they wouldn't have to buy him out of the contract that they got. But then they eventually had to cut him, and then Laura Schuler Donner was the one who said to use Hugh Jackman, and that's how we got Hugh Jackman.
And from my understanding, wasn't Hugh Jackman, he was on Broadway at the time in Oklahoma?
I'm not sure. I think he was, though.
But, I mean, at the time, Hugh Jackman, he was better known as a stage actor. I believe he had done some television and film work in Australia.
Yes.
But he was not a household name in the United States.
I had never heard of him before X-Men 1. And he was amazing in it. I really don't know what it would have been like with Doug Reese Scott. I don't know if it would have been as good.
And in Hugh Jackman, I know he's joked about how, when he was brought on to the first X-Men film, he had no idea what a Wolverine was. He didn't even know that was an animal. He thought, he's like a wolf man, a werewolf. I had no idea. But obviously, awesome. Hugh Jackman fell in love with that character, as did all of us in the room. I mean, when you talk about the great superhero actors, you have Christopher Reeve as Superman, Michael Keaton as the Dark Knight.
Of course.
Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, Tony Stark, and Hugh Jackman as Wolverine. This is the man that defined this character for an entire generation. It's not even for an entire generation. There was no precedent.
No, none at all.
Other than the animated series and the video games, Hugh Jackman was the first true live-action portrayal of this character. Whereas, Christopher Reeve, there were other amazing Supermans before him. There have been other great Batmans before Michael Keaton. Hugh Jackman sort of is at this point in history is the beginning and the end for that character.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he had a lot of love for the character, and when the subsequent sequels came around, he had more creative control. He went back to the comics, read the comics, and developed some of those later storylines on film. So, I think we all lucked out having someone who was that passionate about the role
Absolutely.
get it in the first place.
And I think, he was older,
Yeah.
and he had taken him a while to make it, and he understood that X-Men is why he's here.
That's his bread and butter.
And
Yeah.
I think he always has had a massive respect for X-Men and Singer. But I think what's interesting is that his performance is so good, and there's this great story about Bryan directing Hugh Jackman on the set of X-Men. David Hayter was like, Bryan, we're going to have the nicest Wolverine ever. He's too nice. He's too sweet. Like, Hugh is just, he says Hugh is just a really nice person. So Bryan went up to Hugh's face and he was like, you need to be edgier. You need to be meaner. You need to be tougher. You need to go home and have a fight with your wife. Have a screaming match with your wife. And he's like yelling at Hugh. And Hugh apparently said, Bryan, if I went home and got in a fight like that with my wife, I'd come in crying. And we were all like, oh shit. Apparently that's one of the stories. And I'm just like, that's how Bryan directs his actors. And I think this is the first film where we have real hardcore testimony about his directing style and how he gets great performances out of doing shit like that.
But obviously it worked because at that time, like we said, Hugh Jackman, he was playing Curly in Oklahoma on Broadway.
Yeah.
He's a very tall, attractive, conventionally pretty guy
Yes.
Who has this background in musical theater. But you watch that first X-Men, you don't know who he is. He's like the next Clint Eastwood walking onto the screen. So whatever Bryan Singer did to kind of form him into that character, it absolutely worked on camera.
Yeah.
I think it's amazing what Hugh Jackman was able to do on such short notice as well, kind of coming in right at the end.
As a matter of fact, hadn't they been filming for 2 weeks already?
Without Dougray Scott.
Yeah,
Yeah.
before Hugh Jackman even came on set.
Yeah, they kept having to shoot around Dougray Scott, so they were just doing everything else without Wolverine. So yeah, it was already going for sure.
It is kind of funny. They've talked about how the very first scene they filmed, it was when Wolverine wakes up in the mansion. He's running down the corridors, and he has his shirt off, but he didn't have enough time to get pumped up, so he would continually work out during the film. And I think the last thing they shot was the opening cage match where he's a little bit more jacked up.
Yeah, he is huge in that scene for sure.
Yeah.
I think what's also interesting about Bryan's production thing on here is that this was the first time on set where his tempestuous nature, as they call it in this article, becomes a real thing. And in interviews at the time in 2000, he did concede he was taking pain medication for a bad back, and that's going to be a storyline he's going to use for the next 20 or so years about his onset offset things, that he's on this kind of pain medication for his back. So
And what a coincidence. I was literally in a car accident 2 days ago. I'm on pain medication for that back. So I know where Bryan is coming from.
dang it. No, this is a professional podcast. Nobody is on muscle relaxers or
They're
tranquilizers.
prescribed. So
But others on the set said his drug use was problematic, leading to late arrivals, mood swings, explosive tantrums. Apparently, Rebecca Romano's Mystique took 9 hours of body pain, and he, on a whim, would decide not to use her in the scene when she came on, and he saw the scene wasn't working because Bryan Singer's an artist, and she comes out, and he's like, this scene is bullshit. And that's what Hayter says. He says Singer has an exceptional bullshit detector. And that when something doesn't work while he's filming it, he talks to his writer and says to rewrite it. He's like, give me a line. He gives Bryan a line. Bryan says it to the actor, and then the actor says it. That's apparently a lot of how he works. And I think what's interesting is that after the whole Rebecca Romaine thing, where he's like, the scene's not really working with her. We don't need her. And she got really mad and apparently called Laura Schuler Donner, not Richard. And was like, something needs to happen. So she sent a coffee getter at the time, Kevin Feige, to the set in Canada to, quote, keep an eye on Bryan, which I guess is just drive his twinks around to their hotels or something. I don't know. That is the first real story of the many, many stories about Bryan's tempestuous nature on set. But for some reason, his films are always really good. Oh, there was another writer on it. I forgot to mention this. The person who produced Avatar and Altered Carbon, Leda Kalogridis, apparently did an early script of it too. I haven't seen Altered Carbon. I heard it's good though. But I think what's the most amazing about Singer is that all this stuff is happening. The movie comes out, he sees it, or not, it doesn't come out. He sees a rough cut, and it's awful, apparently. So he cuts it from 2.5 hours to 95 minutes, and it was him cutting everything that made the film good. Laura Schuler Donner didn't even show up for the premiere, right? Because she thought it was going to be so bad. But he recut it, re-edited it, 95 minutes, made like $300 million worldwide.
Hey man, where was Bryan Singer when they made Wonder Woman 84?
For real, for real.
Right. I'll do respect to Patty Jenkins.
It could be good.
Yeah.
I mean, and Bryan has this great quote where he said, "I never really read comics as a kid, but I was a great fan of science fiction and fantasy literature and movies. When X-Men was presented to me, I started to examine the material and look at the characters' histories. This was Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's way of commenting on prejudice." So that's, for the next 20 years of X-Men, that's going to be kind of the guiding theme of all the X-Men movies, essentially. That's most of the production history. Oh yeah, and apparently Bryan Singer banned comic books from the set because he didn't want people to be using it as like a reference. So people have to smuggle comics onto the set for Hugh Jackman in his trailer.
Like, on one side, I feel like that does give ammo to... Nowadays, it's very popular and cool to hate on those earlier X-Men films. Oh, Bryan Singer didn't read comics, they're not faithful, blah, blah, blah. I mean, they kind of judge them with a double standard that they don't... It's not the same... They're held under a higher scrutiny than something like the Avengers films, which... The MCU can change whatever they want. No one complains. If Bryan Singer tweaks something or changes something, he's a monster and he doesn't understand the source material. But on the other hand, it does kind of make sense because at that point, when the film's already in development, they've already done their research. Bryan, he knows the world inside and out. He understands it. It's not up to the actors to read, these two-dimensional... 4-color pages. Their job is to make the performance as real and believable as possible. So I feel like at that point, maybe reading the comic books isn't a necessity for everyone on set.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just not the vibe he wanted for the film. He did not want the characters on the film to act and look like the comics, really. They wanted them to internally be like those characters. But as for the look and how they moved or acted, he was not into that.
And real quick, speaking on that, like as far as comic books, is it true that there was no bub for Wolverine in the script, and that Hugh Jackman said that because he knew it was in the comics?
I don't think it was in the script that I read.
It might not have been. Yeah,
Yeah.
I heard that.
I don't think I read it. I think he because he made up a couple good lines in that film. That might have been one of them.
Yeah, the one watching that Wheels.
Oh yeah.
What are they calling you? Wheels.
Okay. Yes, but it's interesting the film had such a kind of tumultuous pre-production history, and even it sounds like there were a lot of blows on set. Not those kind of blows. That's for the trailer.
That's the next episode.
That's the next episode. But all things considered, X-Men by today's standards is a very modestly budgeted film. It didn't cost $250 million any your average tentpole movie.
Yeah.
What was the budget on that?
75.
Yeah.
$75 million. Which
in 99 money would be what, 150 now, 130, something like that.
Yeah, which is still
modest.
Well, it's still pretty healthy, but it's not like a Spider-Man 3 $380 million budget.
God, that budget. I don't think they still no one knows the budget of Avatar. God knows how much that budget was.
So, X-Men 2000. Does it hold up as a film?
Yeah. I would say so.
What do you think?
I watched it the other week. I still enjoyed it. I think earlier, just discussing, and you made valid points as far as, I think as a kid, you grow up with those toys, you grow up with the animated show, and in theaters you're watching it and you love it because it's the X-Men, but the one thing that you think's missing is the costumes itself. The yellows, the blues, but then... hearing what you're having to say, Connor, about, Bryan Singer saying, more grounded, not being funny.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely probably due to Joel Schumacher, Batman and Robin. Didn't want no Ice Age, but, I think really and truly when it's all said and done, if he wanted grounded, definitely made it grounded. I see it also even now looking at it. There might be hairstyles and stuff that make it seem like late 90s, early 2000s, but for the most part, I think you could really, it's a pretty timeless type piece more than some of your other superhero movies that came out later.
Yeah. As far as the cinematography and the production design, to me it's still pretty sleek.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, okay, so you mentioned the costumes. That was something that was funny, even as a 9-year-old kid, I understood having seen stuff like Blade, the Tim Burton Batman films, movies like The Crow.
Yeah.
You know, what works...
The Crow is good. I like that one.
Oh, that's a great one. But what works on the page, those bright primary reds, yellows, blues, purples, it doesn't necessarily translate to the big screen. Like, but even as a 9-year-old kid, I knew if I saw, you know, Val Kilmer wearing gray and blue spandex, it would look ridiculous. Now, I know people argue the rubber muscles and the nipples are pretty ridiculous, but at the end of the day, you still get the sense that, like, okay, what works in 2D doesn't always necessarily translate well.
Correct.
And especially if you want to do a more grounded take, why not take the Blade approach and go with the black leather, the uniform, something more tactical. Even as an adult, that makes more sense from a purely practical position, because the
budgetary too.
Budgetary. Yeah. Because the X-Men, they're basically a team of mercenaries, but they're a team. They have to have a sense of uniformity. If everyone's going out in their different Halloween costumes, it wouldn't quite make as much sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
So again, I'm not against the costumes. I think they could be done really well now. Judging by some of the work Marvel Studios has done recently, you can incorporate a little bit more color and flair to it. But again, that does take some doing. You can't just take that.
You gotta ease into
2D model.
Yeah.
You gotta, like, Iron Man 1's still pretty grounded.
Yeah.
You know? Like, it didn't start off like Iron Man 3. There's a lot of budget concerns with his approach as well. The keeping it grounded and realistic. Like, that's a good approach to not spend a lot of money, you know? And I think also The Matrix really was just such a massive movie. The influence of that film just cannot be understated.
Yeah.
Like the leather, you like the sounds of Wolverine fighting Mystique. You're like the like all these crazy, you know, like it's very much sounds like a Matrix fight, and it's as brutal as one too.
But to be credit where credit is due, like you said, even the idea of the slow-mo, sped-up action scenes, that came from Blade. The crazy, over-the-top sound effects and the kung fu choreography, that was something that existed in Hong Kong cinema for decades before the Wachowskis.
It's just the popularity of
the
Matrix. Like the way the Wachowskis combined all these things and made them into a pop. It's so popular.
Yeah.
Like that. They probably took from it, but they popularized, and I think that is in X-Men a little bit. Not that it's a Matrix ripoff, I'm not saying that, but the aesthetic, the sound, it's definitely in there.
But wasn't X-Men already in production as, like, the Matrix came out in theaters? So
it started production in, like, summer '99.
Okay.
So I think that around the same time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there was time to incorporate some of that stuff if they wanted to.
It's also just in the air, too, I think, that kind of filmmaking.
Well, Connor, what do you think about X-Men as a film?
I am a huge fan. It's my favorite X-Men film besides Days of Future Past. And I think because it is the perfect origin movie for a cast that is that big. No other director has really had to do that. Like, of any superhero movie. Just immediately introducing 10 characters, making them all different, and introducing their powers in organic and interesting ways that isn't just expository bullshit. And I think that the effect of X-Men is so prevalent on film, and like I do want to go through like the movie, maybe not scene by scene, but just the opening monologue of Patrick Stewart talking about mutation, and there's these animated chromosomes doing this beautiful like symmetrical dance with each other, it looks like. And then you go into the opening credits of the DNA stream, and I don't know what it is, but it looks exactly like the opening credits of Spider-Man, the opening credits of Hulk. It's so influential just in that opening, and you can tell from that opening that this is going to be like an artistically interesting movie, I think. Just like the designs of the chromosomes and the credits, and then you go into the actual opening.
And let's talk about that. When you're going into your big tentpole summer superhero movie for kids, when you have literally like Burger King and Happy Meal toys riding on this franchise, how else are you going to open up your movie except with a sequence in the fucking Holocaust?
Yeah.
Like just a concentration. Oh, it's in Auschwitz, of course. It has to be, right?
That's how you start your superhero movie. Just put it in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. There you go. Yeah, and I think what's interesting watching that scene again, not only how ballsy it is to start it off like that, and how it immediately says this is a serious film that you're going to have to pay attention to and watch, but it's also, when I was watching it as a kid, the twist of the kid being Magneto. Like, you're watching the opening of it, and, like, I didn't really know much about it, so I was like, what's this Holocaust thing? I feel sorry for this kid. He's being separated from his parents, and then he puts his hand out, and he starts bending the metal, and you're just like, oh, shit. And like to me as a kid, and like I think a lot of first time viewers who didn't know anything about the X-Men, seeing that, it automatically is like the villain is not, he's not like the Joker, or you know, like he's like a real person, you know, and that humanizing of Magneto is still prevalent in X-Men, I think. It's just a great scene.
You know, it's weird. I do distinctly remember as a kid with that opening sequence. For some reason, I was aware that was Magneto. But having gone back and watched the X-Men animated series on Disney Plus, it is kind of weird. Like in the show, they never reference the Holocaust or Nazis. Mm-hmm. And like I think Magneto, they do vaguely reference he had some kind of tragic childhood, but they never clarify that. Mm-hmm. But even when I was watching X-Men 1, I still kind of got that was supposed to be Magneto.
Yeah.
But I do remember that scene in theaters.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful scene. Yeah. Just pure cinema. The blues and the rain. God. And it's just Bryan Singer saying this is a serious film. That's the opening. And
it's so good that Matthew Vaughn recreated it shot for shot in 2011's X-Men First Class.
No need to improve that scene. You don't need to improve it. It's a perfect scene. And like, you know, the numbers on the Jews, and then, you know, relating that later to the mutant registry. Like, this is all very Bryan Singer, especially coming from Apt Pupil, like his first Nazi movie, I mean.
He's got a Nazi fetish.
It's in almost all of his films. He talks about Nazism a lot. What's amazing is that opening with the villain, you know, like that's just the perfect way to open a superhero movie to me. Batman Returns does it. Dark Knight. Opening with the villain and like a scene with the villain, that's the way to do it. That's the way to do it. You gotta introduce the villain. So after that scene is the scene where Rogue kisses the boy and discovers that she has the ability to take people's life if they are not a mutant, or take their lives and powers if they are a mutant. But she kisses the boy and he goes into like this like shock, and she runs away from home. Mm-hmm. And I think what's really interesting is what Bryan Singer is doing in this scene is, I don't know, he's essentially saying he's using like teenage sexuality and like burgeoning sexuality as a metaphor for mutation. And I think a lot of that has to do with Bryan being gay and her discovering her mutant powers during like sexual play, you know. And I think that's a really interesting, because you hear it's like, oh, it's puberty, and you always hear that like puberty happens, but like in X1 it's specifically sexual, and equating mutation to sexuality, I think, has a lot to do with Bryan's own life and who he is. It's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Spencer, did you have any thoughts on that for X-Men film? Anything that stuck out in particular?
You know, as far as when I rewatched X-Men, I'll be honest, like I don't watch it every year, every couple years. I watched it for this. Mm-hmm. And you know, fan growing up, but you know, you go years without seeing certain films. And it's crazy the one thing that does always stick out to me is when what's his name, Senator Kelly is coming out of the ocean, you know?
That scene's really kind of notable because it is the first time in a modern theatrical film where Stan Lee gets a cameo as a hot dog vendor. Or is he a hot dog vendor?
He's the vendor,
Yeah, he's the hot dog vendor. And Connor, some other interesting characters our audience may be less familiar with have cameos in that scene.
Yes, Gary Goddard is one of the men walking alongside, staring at Kelly while he's walking naked up the beach. He is a big friend of Bryan Singer. He actually came up with the Wolverine line during the cage match, where he's introduced as the Wolverine. Mm-hmm. Gary Goddard actually came up with that. Brian Peck, who did the commentary with Bryan Singer, is also in that scene. He plays the guy holding the hot dog that Stan Lee is the vendor of. So he's there holding the hot dog like, what? And Brian Peck is a convicted child molester. Gary Goddard has been accused of child molestation by 20 people. And Stan Lee is also in it. So there's a lot of, like, Bryan's entire life is just there. Like, you have Stan Lee at cameo. Revolutionary, totally changed film. It's in every single Marvel movie now. The influence cannot be denied. And all the sins, like, sinful people that he knows are in the shot. That is just Bryan Singer's career in a nutshell, man. And also, like, I think that the Jean Grey lecture where she's like, where Kelly's like, we need to know where these mutants are and what they can do, and this and that, and we need to register them, give them all numbers. And I think that's just the fact that it came out in 2000 before 9/11. It's kind of eerie hearing all that, and the climax is in New York, destroying the Liberty. Like, there's just a lot of weird foreshadowing to 9/11 in that film, and the Muslim hysteria and hatred, and he was just so ahead of his time, man. He's a fucking genius. That's all I could say, dude.
Well, even now, the movie is as timely as ever with our sort of like post-Trump society, where you see like the vitriol and the rage for different groups of people on both sides. I don't want to politicize this, but it's just interesting how the demonization of the other, certain political plans are enacted, put in place to defend our walls. We have to defend our borders from this outsider. These bad people want to take these things away from us as Americans. They want to take our God-given rights away.
Yep. And they could be any one of us.
Yeah. But also, I think that's why the X-Men as a brand, as a group of characters, has had such an appeal for the last 50 years, because you do have the outsiders. I know Stanley's talked about how he envisioned Professor X being an allegory for Martin Luther King Jr. Magneto was supposed to be the radical Malcolm X side of the civil rights movement.
Yep.
So, I mean, that's why X-Men does have an appeal to anyone that might feel a little bit different, whether you're gay, part of a minority group, I guess now, like if you're in the trans community, a lot of those issues can speak to people on different levels.
Yeah, and that's what I think, Bryan, what elevates him as a filmmaker above most of the other people who make this stuff is he's willing to talk about those things. Like, he wants his films to matter and be important and be about issues and speak to people who do not have a voice, And I think that most superhero movies, especially these days, do the exact opposite. They're for the mass voice. They're for the collective voice. They're so inoffensive and not about anything that you can't even engage with them emotionally, really. They're always just kind of funny and shit's blowing up, whereas like X1 is a really dark, interesting movie about prejudice and growing up, and there's a lot of love triangles, and there's so much just going on intrinsically in X-Men because Bryan is at the head of it. That's what I would say. Like, he is the reason that movie is interesting. It's not anyone else, honestly.
Yeah.
And he's just using great IP to explore those ideas, I think.
But obviously these ideas resonated because this movie was a tremendous success when it came out in July 2000.
It grossed 298 million or 300 million, and essentially they greenlit X2 almost immediately. I think it was
money talks, man.
Yeah, and he came back. There was no like, you need to do better, you need to act better on this set, you need to be more professional. There was none of that. They just brought him back. So you could berate his behavior, but they're allowing it to happen. So someone is enabling him.
So yeah, X2, XMen United, as it was known in the United States, was released 3 years after X-Men. And the genre had kind of changed a little bit. So in those 3 years, you had the release of the most important one, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man in 2002, which shattered records above and beyond the business X-Men did. You had Ang Lee's Hulk, which was less successful. You had Blade 2, directed by Guillermo del Toro, which, as Connor mentioned, it's not his favorite of the franchise.
It's okay. It's just not Blade 1. That's my opinion. I'm not saying...
Yeah, but...
It's just my opinion.
But even so in 2003, you had a lot of competition. Aside from Hulk, you also had Daredevil with Ben Affleck. So X-Men had definitely opened some doors in Hollywood and had a little bit more competition the second time around. Would Bryan Singer be able to deliver on that level, knowing that this film doesn't exist in a vacuum anymore?
It's an even bigger hit than X1. Like, it grossed almost 500 million. And the stories on the X2 set, we'll get into those like at a later date, but they're pretty much the same, if not a little worse than his behavior on X1. Yeah, it makes even more money and it's even better, but according to most people somehow. And that's going to be the theme of him, is like his productions are going to be insane and everyone's going to write him off, but for somehow the final product is usually pretty good, and that's because he's, a great filmmaker. He's the Freddie Mercury, for sure, of his band, of the John Ottman Stiegel band.
All right, so X-Men 1 was a tremendous success because it was able to resonate with so many different people and speak to people in different ways. But I don't think we can give Bryan Singer enough credit to some of his contributions to the mythology.
Correct.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating that now we kind of take for granted, Charles Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. But when you think about it, if you go back and watch those 90s animated series episodes, the school, it's basically a training facility for these adult X-Men or these adult mutants learning how to hone and control their power and work together as a tactical force. But it really wasn't, if I'm not mistaken, until X-Men in 2000, the film, where it really did become an actual school, like accredited school for children learning how to control their powers and grow up in the system. Do you want to talk about that?
He made that choice early on. I think it was in the script already, but he had final say in terms of what the school would actually look like, the mansion, and in the commentary he goes into the mansion, where it was and how it was like a mansion actually converted into a school to shoot there. So he was very interested in using the mansion, and he took the sign, the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters sign. That was one of the things he took from the set as a souvenir. So he pushed that a lot. The bringing in of kids, mostly adolescents, I don't know what that means, into the school, these gifted youngsters from broken homes or who are runaways and are all like 16 or 17, which is Bryan's, type, and putting them all in this mansion together and creating something beautiful out of it. And I do think that Bryan's personal life, which we'll talk about in the other episodes, but there's a connection there, I think.
Yeah.
And it's not as nefarious or evil as you might think. It's actually a very positive part of the film, is that this is a real school where, homeless youth essentially can be rehabilitated and be taught that they are important and that they matter. And once again, most superhero movies are not like that. If anything, the other is like bad. It's like aliens or gods or, there's always the other that is just bad. But I think, turning it into a school, huge. We all, like you said, we all just take it for granted now that that's how it always was, and it wasn't. That's just the shadow that this one film casts is so great that it's hard to even get out of it to see what it's influenced, because it's just everywhere now.
Yeah, we've already established the Freddie Mercury connection. Do you think Bryan Singer fancies himself a Charles Xavier type figure?
I think that he does, in a sense, not in the way a Michael Jackson would.
Yeah.
I think Michael Jackson there's very clear reasons why he would be interested in playing Professor X. But I think Bryan does, his connection with the mansions, being around young people and giving them a shot. I think he does see himself as someone who is helping people. And now that everyone's turned against him, I think it shocks him all the more. But I just want to talk about the intros of Charles and Eric for a sec.
Yeah.
Where you come around on his epic bald head of Patrick Stewart while he's watching Jean Grey give the lecture, and then he follows Magneto out into the hallway where there's so many reflections of glass, and they all create these X's like all the way down the bridge, and then the wheelchair rolls up and the X's of the wheel is like straight up in the frame. It's not tilted or anything. It's a really composed shot. And the fedora on Magneto and the talking, it's so badass. That's such a well shot scene. I'm a big fan.
We are the future, Charles, not them.
I just think the X's, the glass, the X on the chair, the fedora over the face, and I mean, like, dude, Bryan Singer's such an artist. Like, who puts that amount of care into a superhero movie now?
And that's the one shot, like, that's the one time, the first time we see the faded tattoo on Magneto's wrist, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or the adult.
The adult Magneto,
Eric Fletcher, yeah.
Yeah, it's like all faded and kind of, but it's still there. You know? And it's kind of interesting, Nazi war criminal and that pupil to Holocaust survivor. Great actor.
Sir Ian McKellen, yeah.
I don't know. There's just a lot of specific shots that Bryan does in the film that I feel are really artistically good. Like, in the cage match where Logan is fighting the truckers, there's like a shot where he's leaning against the cage, smoking a cigar and blowing it up into these blue LED lights above him, and he's just silhouetted. And I'm just like, this looks like an art film, like a shot like that. Like, I'm
Yeah.
like, this is a really good, and like the smoke is thick and gray and the LED is blue. It's kind of like buzzing almost. You can hear it buzzing a little bit. And I'm like, dude, this is the amount of craft and art in Siegel and Singer's work on this film is, it's in every scene. I could go through every scene like that, you know? It's incredible. And like Logan also has like the yellow stripes on his biking jacket, which I thought was kind of funny. Kind of Bryan Singer just being like, yeah, we know you want the yellow.
Yeah.
We know you want the yellow. You're not getting it. This is what you get.
Well, I mean, to be fair, they do incorporate some of the designs and the color schemes in those X-Men uniforms. So Cyclops, he has the blue piping on his uniform.
Mm-hmm.
In the first movie, Jean Grey has green piping. Because as Marvel Girl, her color in Phoenix, she had green, but then when she becomes the Dark Phoenix, she has the red piping in X2.
Oh, okay. I didn't notice that. God, he's such a genius.
Yeah, Storm has the silver piping on her uniform. And then Logan has kind of like the orange piping, which in the 80s he had the orange and brown costume.
Oh,
for the
wow.
longest
I
time.
forgot about that.
Yeah, so the
Damn.
color schemes are incorporated. It's just a little bit more subtle than the full-on Halloween costumes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love. I also love Magneto's lair because it's all tunnels again.
Yeah.
There's more tunnels. Bryan Singer loves tunnels. He says it in the commentary. He loves tunnels. There's a lot of
So he does
tunnels.
reference that.
Yeah, he does reference it in the commentary, talking to Peck. Also, Peck says that he's going to watch Willard with Bryan Singer, and that it's about a teenage boy who has a lot of rats. And he was ratted on by a teenage boy and went to jail. I don't know.
Huh. Interesting.
But-
Coincidence?
Oh yeah, I also really love the camera work of following Hugh Jackman down the hall and into the school while Xavier's talking to him.
Yeah.
Very De Palma-esque around all those pillars and stuff. And the way the audio goes in and out on different sides of the speakers. It's just well done cinema. It's
Yeah.
not around anymore. The moving of the camera with the awesome Michael Kamen score, you know?
Oh, let's talk about that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Michael Kamen had this really great minimalist score. Of course, Michael Kamen, great longtime film composer.
Legend.
He did License to Kill with Timothy Dalton. He did Highlander, 1986. That's a great score. Also a collaboration with Queen and Freddie Mercury, so there is that connection.
Whoa, I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Highlander soundtrack. It's famous. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting because prior to X-Men, and even subsequently, Bryan Singer's greatest musical collaborator is the composer-editor John Ottman, which John would go on to edit and score the remainder of his films. But John Ottman also came up through the same kind of college circles Bryan did and wanted to take a stab as a director. So at the time of X-Men 1's production, he was directing the film Urban Legend Final Cut.
Oh, yeah.
So John Ottman was not available to edit or score that first X-Men movie.
Which is why it's a little choppy. A little bit.
A little bit.
It's not noticeable, but comparing it to Ottman's editing on the other ones, there's a different feel to it.
So Connor, what gave Bryan the idea to get Michael Kamen as a replacement? Why him?
Honestly, I have never heard him talk about Michael Kamen.
Really?
I listened to the commentary. He doesn't reference the score once.
Yeah.
You know?
I don't think he was a fan. I did read he wasn't as pleased with it as he was. So
yeah, and he also in the commentary just rips up the editing people. Like he says the biggest problem over and over again on X1 was the editorial department. That's what he said.
Yeah.
So I think that the score and the editing, he did not like either of those things. And I think John Ottman coming back on X2, really, it's a different feel. You know, it's a different kind of feel of a film. It's a little more elegant.
Didn't he want John Williams at one point?
That would make sense because Bryan Singer, obviously, if you look at his work at Superman Returns, he reveres and idolizes Richard Donner's Superman. He's a huge Star Wars fan. So, yeah, it would make sense. If you're a hot young director in Hollywood working on this big film, why wouldn't John Williams be your first choice?
Yeah. True.
Also, I do want to mention the John Williams connection. He did visit the set of Episode 1 in '97 while they were shooting, I think, in Tunisia.
Bryan Singer
Bryan Singer, sorry.
Wow.
Bryan Singer did visit the set and walked and talked with George Lucas. He visited the set of Episode 1 and the set of Titanic with James Cameron to learn how to use green screens for X-Men, because it was going to be the first film he had ever made that used extensive green screens. Wow. So
it should be noted that both of those films, Titanic and The Phantom Menace, are both 20th Century Fox co-productions.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah. So I guess they flew him out to those or something, and so that's where he got his education for special effects movie making. George Lucas and James Cameron.
Damn.
Maybe that's why his movies are good. Definitely helped.
But yes, I mean, speaking of that, Bryan Singer is... I don't want to say he's not interested in the special effects, but I feel like for Bryan, the story and the characterization comes first and foremost. And that's why he's such a good filmmaker.
Mm-hmm. And that's why that first episode we did is important, because those are very character-driven films.
Yeah.
And it really shows those instincts are all in X-Men. You know, a lot of people like me were hit over the head by how cool and different it was. But if you look at his filmography, there's definitely an evolution, you know, of the things he's talking about. And it is kind of the next step, I think, for sure. Oh, also, I think what's interesting, the flashbacks that Logan has in the film to being experimented on, you know? Bryan said that he added the wine glasses and the people drinking wine to add he wanted a festive element.
Oh, the champagne?
And I think that's a really good touch. And he doesn't explain why. It's just, it sounds like an instinct, but like, dude, that guy, he knows how to make movies. Adding the champagne? Damn, that's a great touch. Whew. Man, the guy's got great instincts. Oh yeah, the last thing I wanted to say about the commentary is that Bryan Singer, the Statue of Liberty being the big set piece, he references that a lot. There's a lot of shots of like toys of the Statue of Liberty, or the Statue of Liberty being in the background of certain shots, and he's fascinated with the climax taking place on the Statue of Liberty, which he says is like the immigrants coming to America, and they're the outsider mutants coming, you know, to Ellis Island to get to America. It's like I said, that kind of thought, putting that thought into it is just amazing. There's so many layers to X-Men 1. Yeah. This is just the first X-Men movie, and like I'm barely scratching the surface of it, for sure.
Yeah, Godfather Part 2, great film. If you're going to steal it, stick it from the dust.
Dude, that is a great film.
Yeah.
Oh, and the plastic prison, just awesome. Looks cool.
Yeah.
I love the plastic prison. And apparently in the commentary, he said that Stewart and McKellen didn't know how to play chess, and you know, they brought a chess expert on set to help them learn how to play chess. Mm-hmm. And, you know, uses like this weird like king sacrifice move to beat him or something like that. I don't know. Even the name of the move is like has correlated with what the two characters are doing in the scene.
Yeah.
Pretty badass.
And in X-Men 2, isn't Magneto reading the Once and Future King?
Yes!
Yeah, so Spencer, do you have any closing thoughts?
No, not really, except, I mean, once again, when I watched it the other week, it's as good as it was when I saw it as a kid.
Hell yeah, dude.
It's not one of those where, you know, I mean, I'll take Batman animated series as something like that transitioned with me from childhood to adulthood, and there's no, like, everything I remember of it is exactly the way it was. It's badass. You know, now you try to, for me anyway, and this is just my opinion, I try to watch Power Rangers as an adult. It does not do well.
Really?
Like, I lose...
Well,
I lose my...
I've got it. I mean, Power Rangers is obviously aimed towards younger children.
Correct.
And that's why it had such an impact. Yeah. Where you watch it now, I can still appreciate the camp value.
Correct.
And, you know, the humor for children, like, it has a charm to it.
Yeah.
But it's not meant for, like, adults or families to watch it. Whereas Batman the Animated Series, X-Men the Animated Series... Correct. You know, some of the animation may not be as, like, smooth or clean as, like, a Disney movie. But you watch it, I mean, those still have really strong scripts and character development. Yeah. And you could do those in live action, they would be just as good.
Yeah. But yeah, I think it just transitions very well, for me, to my adulthood.
Like you mentioned earlier, man, X-Men 1, it's one of those films where, I mean, the movie's so sleek and well-directed, aside from a couple of, like, early millennium hairstyles. You can watch it today, to me, it looks as good or... it holds up as well as anything like Iron Man or Thor or Captain America. Yeah. It has a very sleek, timeless style to it.
Yes, I would say X-Men 1, it does hold up remarkably well. I think it does have a lot to do with the time it was made and how not everything was CGI yet, and I get all that, but also the seriousness of it, the urgency of it, you know, the coolness. It's just a very cool movie. You know, it doesn't feel like Raimi's Spider-Man, which feels much broader, I would say. Not that that's good or bad, but it's definitely a broader film. It's not as dark or edgy or quote cool. And I think that X-Men 1 is a badass movie, and I think that because it's so serious and interesting, that's why it's to me sticks with me a lot more than other films that either came out around that time or even now that are made on that scale, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned this earlier, but I think even from the beginning, as they've kept making more X-Men films and spin-offs set in that universe, X-Men 1 has always been in my top 3. I think now, with the 20th Century Fox franchise coming to an end, my top 3 favorite X-Men films are Logan, Days of Future Past, and that original X-Men movie.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why it holds up is, I think at the time, you couldn't take for granted that, like, oh, yeah, we can half-ass it. We'll get a sequel. We'll do another one.
Yeah.
They actually had to concentrate on making a good movie. They wanted to make the best movie they possibly could. So in that first film, you do have that 50 years of X-Men conflict. You have the civil rights allegories. You have Magneto as the sympathetic anti-hero turned villain. You have Professor X's mission. You have Wolverine as this badass / struggling loner father figure to Rogue with the heart of gold.
I like that relationship.
It's great, and that's something that's kind of borrowed from the comics and animated series.
Yeah.
In the 80s, he was sort of a mentor to the Kitty Pryde character. In the animated series, it was Jubilee as like the young up-and-coming teenager who joins the team and becomes something greater. And in the movie, Bryan kind of combined the Rogue and Jubilee characters to get the character that Anna Paquin played on the big screen. But yeah, X-Men 1, it has all those essential elements that made the X-Men so well loved in a 50-year span that, really all it's missing is the Sentinels.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty definitive take. But yeah, X-Men, great movie, holds up. It's kind of a shame that they're going to reboot it and it's going to be lost to history. But hey, it's on Disney Plus if you want to check it out.
Yeah, Disney has brought in Singer's X-Men films. They're there. You can watch all of Singer's X-Men movies on Disney Plus. You can still listen to his commentary with Brian Peck, convicted child molester, on the Blu-rays. It's all still out there. They haven't gotten rid of it yet. Get your fill because they're coming for it. And that's why we're doing this, is because there are people out here like us where his X-Men film, especially the first one, are very, very important, not just to me personally, but to cinema, to the history of cinema.
That was very well said. Once again, I'm Ryan Bijan, and I'm here with
Connor Quade.
Spencer Wallace.
We'll see you next time.